Yeah, I just was starting there. Okay, hopefully when I talk, I'll okay, so, right, let's go ahead and we'll just do stand-up. Quentin.
All right, so I am just working through some stuff on the assembly line Weaver. And I think there's still like a lot of work we have to do for the next steps document generation to work out of the box. I want to make sure that more forms will work right away, even with the next steps documents. So a lot of iteration there to get them to work a little bit better.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I was taking a look at some of the fixes you had made there, and I couldn't tell, like, it looked like I was mostly confused because like I could genuinely not reproduce any of the stuff that you were seeing, and I wasn't sure if it was because I wasn't just using the install on server, and how much of it was just like issues with that versus there were like, I know there were like a handful of like small typos and stuff in the docs, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it's more just like if your document doesn't have, there's some things where it shouldn't trigger behavior if we're always including a cover page. So like there's one where potentially there's no phone number that's associated with the court because you typed in the court. We don't have any question that asks for the phone number of a court. There are some fields that were required that should have been optional. So I think in general, we just don't want the cover page to trigger variables that the person didn't otherwise make part of their interview.
I see, that makes sense.
So that every kind of form can work out of the box, basically. I think that's more what it is. It will work in the right circumstances for like a realistic form, but some of the smaller tests that I've been doing don't work out of the box, which I think hopefully they should.
Gotcha, that makes sense.
But that's been keeping me busy today. Because all the other forms, I want to test them to make sure they run, and if the cover page doesn't work, then it's harder to test for the actual PR I was trying to make.
All right. Sorry, I added a little distractions here, but okay, Bryce.
Yeah, so I've made some progress on just like set enough release notification stuff. It's still a bash script, but it should, at least most of it seems feasible to like eventually be like part where we've been talking about having like an admin suite interview that like lets you do a bunch of various things easier, and being able to just say like, hey, here's a project that I want to bump the version for, would be much easier, and so you don't have to have everything on bash. It's in bash right now, but at least all the steps could be easily just put in Docker. And I'll try and find some time to do that later. Also doing a bunch of Tyler stuff. I have, if Matt decides or is able to hop on 2 or 1, I have some questions. So I might try and make it a teaching legal Tuesday about how like at least currently how service is working in Illinois with with e-filing, but if you can't like specify the service contact through e-filing, since I know a lot of that there's like ECF5 plans for that, but I know not all of it's in, so I'm just wondering what the current state is. But yeah, other than that, chugging along.
I like chugging along. All right, cool. Michelle?
So I like Quentin's suggestion of small PRs. I also, if there are PRs that are like, folks want to move them along, posting about them in Teams I will see them sooner than just through GitHub notifications. It's just the way I do not remember to check my GitHub notifications through the day. But there are other people, thankfully, that can do PR reviews as well. So that's good too. The testing framework finally run into something that is pretty substantially like would need some overhaul. So when code is used in conjunction with variables like index variables or generic objects, that is not currently solvable with how we are doing things. Lily had an interesting suggestion for a totally different way to do it, which would be for the developer to provide extra information. And the generator cannot generate tests for interviews that use code and index variables or generic variables. So yeah, so I have kind of some doubts about adoption of the testing framework under those circumstances. There's some things we can do specifically for assembly line, possibly, to help with that, but that would mean that if people overwrite stuff and then there's a mix of assembly line and non-assembly line behavior, that would take some complex adjustment. So, I mean, I can describe the change that would be needed by the developer, and see how simple people think that would be, or what I have determined so far, or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not convinced that it will be easy enough for people to put together. Especially not in a way that they understand what's going on. That's where I'm at right now.
All right.
Feel free to ask questions if you want clarification, but here or later, whatever.
Lisa?
I actually have a question. I'm at a totally different level, obviously, than all of you, but you were talking about cover sheets and looking forward to where you're going with all of this. From the coder or like creator end, do you envision that parts of a project will exist independently? Just from my experience working with different document assembly projects, when you get into more complex forms packages, some elements repeat themselves across different kinds of forms packages. And if the coding for them, like a basic motion or an order, or the cover sheet really struck me as one, because here, though, unfortunately, like our different courts have different cover sheets. And so it makes it really hard to have anything that's generic. But I thought that if there are chunks of code that apply to different elements of packages of forms, then you wouldn't have to have different people recreating the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, Bryce just made one of a cover sheet that does just that. So
Yeah,
the answer is yes.
That's part of what assembly line tries to do, is tries to make and help people reuse code and reuse, templates and things like that.
That was my impression. And
Yeah.
how easy it is. I haven't started working with, I didn't want to tamper with the assembly line yet, but how easy it is it to identify which chunks of code serve which purposes?
So it depends on like how you mean by that. So like we have the assembly line repo that's basically like a library that we include when we build things through the Weaver. And the Weaver has a certain anatomy that you can look at. But then there's a lot of stuff that's encoded by reference. I'm going to pause and let someone else talk.
It's an exciting time over there. If Quentin, you want.
I think, Lisa, for the example that you're talking about, it's a Word document that we're talking about, which is the instructions for the user. I'll show you because I've just been editing it. Let's see like what one of these looks like. So this is an example of one of the next steps document templates where we've basically broken down different case types. This is one for the form that starts a case. There's one for maybe responding in the middle of a case, one for a letter. That anytime that you want to give the person who downloads the packet some instructions for how to actually use the packet that you made for them, we have we have 5 different templates like this. And then whoever is working on the actual form would go in and customize this, but they'll all have a consistent look and feel. You can see there's actually not that many variables, but it's things like just for the person's name. I have this highlighted because we don't ask a question, and it seemed like a little clunky to force someone to answer this when they're running through the Weaver. But
yeah, I think this looks great because it's very clean and it's minimalistic. I mean, our guides, unfortunately, some of the folks that in target audience, we require like pages of instructions. It's really hard. I mean, so we have like a guide that goes along with this, but I like the idea of a snapshot of what people need to do, because a lot of times if people see too much text, they won't read any of it. It's just too overwhelming. So
we tried really hard to keep it to like a page at most. But so I think the 2.9 might go to 2 pages. That's our DV form, but I think otherwise 1 page.
And I guess as long as you could link to something that's more specific for folks who want to, there are some things that where we do a package that'll take somebody from the start to the end of the divorce process. And there are just so many steps, like you couldn't cover that in a page. But for any individual form, I mean, in that process too, that this is great. I mean, and this is just the baseline instructions that simpler forms, this is fantastic. And then for more complex forms, I guess there's a way to modify this. So.
Exactly, yeah. And we can't take credit for the design. It was Theory and Principle designed it for us for pro bono, which was really nice.
Yeah, they we had something before that was much busier looking, and I don't know how. I really just knew exactly where to cut.
We might want to, in the documentation, if we can just give them the credit. I'm just thinking, where can we, kind of give the credit for that?
I do have a logo on the front page, but yes, it would be nice to add something really good. But also, Lisa, I don't know if when I stepped away for a second, they also mentioned thinking of cover sheets. Like there's a civil action cover sheet that has to be filed in certain matters. That is like a standalone interview, but then also can be attached to new interviews you make. Or if you have an affidavit of agency or something, you can code that once and then include that interview in your new interviews without having to redo it.
Right. We're fortunate in that we have theoretically a standard informa pauperis or affidavit of indigency form statewide for at least our civil district courts, though some courts do their own thing. But for cover sheets here, it's there are just different challenges based on jurisdiction. But I think what you all are doing is great, and that you're keeping it more streamlined and uniform and interchangeable, using interchangeable pieces. It's really helpful.
It's an interesting balance to hit when you're trying to allow reusability, because you can build up a lot of information that people then need to know about the system in order to use all those different pieces. And so a way of, sharing that knowledge is also as important as the code itself, but also writing the code in a way that reduces that complexity. It's a tricky prospect a lot of times.
All right, well, do we have any other, Lisa, you could just use this time to ask questions.
Well, I still feel the same. I feel badly in that I haven't delved as deeply as I wished I did at this point into this, but I don't think what questions to ask other than if you have things you're seeking feedback about, specific feedback about too. I always feel good about sharing things from my own experience, but I think having a sense of where these will reside can really help the coders too. For example, when I did my document assembly work, which is much more user. It's much more WYSIWYG oriented, but I knew that there was going to be a companion guide, so I didn't have to incorporate too much how-to information. But I'm wondering, like, for example, is it difficult for coders to insert hyperlinks to other resources okay, great. So that I saw everyone's reaction immediately, because that's a really great shortcut. And is there a way to do a pop-up? Like, one thing we did in some of our work, where if there's a word that you can't get around, but you just have to define it for people, but you have to use that word, is there a way in this process to have that word have something you can click on or immediate definition?
Yes.
That's great.
Yeah.
There are a couple different ways to provide extra help on a page. Yeah. And ways tied to specific words, definitely.
That would be something for me to learn about. So that's
if it helps, there are terms, and there's also a help specifier for fields in particular, if you want to write those down to look into later. And there's also you can have a help button for the whole page to give more context on the whole page. Those won't mean much
Great,
now,
thanks.
but hopefully in the future,
Mhm.
they'll provide some pointers.
Words to hang on to. In that case, then what I can do is I just stop recording and then we can just chat about